Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're looking at a very important book. So, this book is Fly Girls, the daring American women pilots who helped win World War II by P. O'Connell Pearson. So, this is a very interesting book about a part of history that we don't hear a lot about. Partially because after these, basically, this is the story of what are called the WASPS. These were women pilots who were doing a couple things during World War II when it came to the military. So they were test pilots. They flew airplanes of all types from the factories to the air bases they needed to be flown at. That would basically take them over where the male pilots would fly them into war. So they were flying these pilots. They tested planes that had just been repaired. They flew target planes. The other thing they did, which was interesting, I never heard of, is in the early years of drones, which, yes, drones literally started existing back in World War I, just obviously not as sophisticated as they are now. And yes, with the same purpose, they wanted unmanned bomb flights. So what the women did, they did two things. One, they flew in the plane following the drone, where you had a male pilot who was actually piloting it. And then these things were small, but still big enough for a woman to get into. Yes, they were manned. The women, there were very few who actually did this, were there to protect the drone, because these things were very, very difficult to create. And this is World War II. They were very expensive, so they didn't want them damaged. So if the woman had realized that something was going wrong, they could take the controls. And they had to resist doing that until the last minute. So these women did all this. They were not militarized until the 70s. They were disbanded 4 months prior to the end of the war. They were, among other things, they weren't given military honors. They weren't treated as military despite the fact that they acted as military. They flew assignments men wouldn't touch. You know those big airplanes they used, the bombers? Yeah, they flew them. The women flew them first. The U.S. military used these women to force basically get the men to fly them because ego. So particularly those bombers that, the controversial bombing of the atomic bombs, those planes were tested out by two women. And basically these two women flew around in this gigantic flying fortress to basically get the men to stop being afraid. It's like, if these women can do it, we should do it. And of course, the moment they were doing it really well, and they were pretty much grounded because they didn't want the men to feel inferior to these women. Even though, yeah, they did it first. These women did amazing things. They died doing these things. They died because of men. In one case, one of these women made a mistake in listening to and deciding to fly in formation with a bunch of men. And one of them, essentially by flying too close because he was being a flyboy and being stupid, accidentally killed her because he flew too close and damaged her plane because he was an idiot. And it was proven when they looked at it that she did nothing wrong. They flew planes, specifically in North Carolina, I think it was Fort Dix, where they had no money and they knew these planes were falling apart. A woman died in a crash because there was a faulty hatch and she couldn't get out. And why some women quit after this, some women, they kept flying. They knew they could die. They risked their lives to help men and to help the war effort. And they were disbanded because they weren't able to talk to the press, and a bunch of white men, arrogant, selfish white men, decided that they weren't going to listen to the military people who knew these women, who were supporting these women. And they convinced Congress that these women weren't doing anything, that they were useless, and that they could just be thrown away. And these women were periodically told they were disposable because they were not men. They couldn't fight in combat, so they were disposable. So, and why a lot of the men who flew with them, the men at the bases where they were stationed, the man who respected them and put this together, fought for them, they were still basically disbanded and thrown away. And they weren't able to talk about it. Their records were sealed for 30 years. And eventually they went on with their lives. Some became pilots, some didn't, because there was basically airlines wouldn't hire them, despite the fact that they probably had more credentials than a lot of men, because they flew a wide variety of planes. That's the other thing. A lot of the men became specialists. They specialized in one type of plane. The women didn't. They didn't know what they were flying one day to the next. They flew everything the military had, no matter what. They took every assignment. They took assignments men wouldn't do. They were treated horribly in many cases, despite the fact that they probably had more credentials than some of these men. They had to meet higher standards. Unfortunately, African American women were not included in this because the women starting this, it was an experiment as it was, and it was hard enough for the Tuskegee Airmen as men to be able to be respected. They didn't want to risk bringing African American women into it. It would complicate things, unfortunately. I'm sure some of those women may have regretted that, but that was the times, and it sucked. So all of these, of course, were white women, but they did amazing things. And they were disbanded, and they weren't given military honors, they weren't given military veterans pensions, they weren't recognized. And they had no voice, and they didn't speak about it. They were quiet until one started doing a reunion. Eventually the 70s happened, and they started fighting. The world had changed. Women were in the military. Women were pilots. Things were changing. And military, Air Force says, we're training the first women's pilots. And these women were like, what? Yeah, no. We did this already. We need recognition now. And they started fighting, and they started making noise. They started talking. And eventually those records were opened up, and they fought with Congress. And not the person who started it, but his son, he had passed, who knew the women, who knew how passionate his father was, fought with them. And they formed a committee, and they started gathering the paperwork. Once those records were open, they were eventually able to prove to Congress that they were treated as de facto military. And Carter signed into law that these women deserved veterans benefits. Their families deserve veterans benefits. They deserve to be able to be buried with military honors. And then finally, in 2015, they fought the family of a woman by the name of, last end of this, there's a lot of references. This is definitely a nonfiction book. A woman by the name, what was her name? She was Eileen Harmon, who died in 2015, in 95. Her children and her grandchildren fought the military to be able to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery. They fought, saying, basically, they were saying, like, they had no right. This bill they passed in 77 didn't give them this right. But they fought, and it was passed, and she was able to be buried at her wishes in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, which she deserved. All of them deserved. They deserved this. They earned this. They earned those military benefits because they did jobs men didn't want to do. So this is an amazing book. It reads really, really well. It's definitely middle school or late elementary. This is definitely technically qualified as a children's book. It's nonfiction. It's an amazing piece of history. It's a great thing to teach your kids because it was forgotten for so long. These women were silenced for so long. Most of them, I'm sure, are passed by now. It's 2020. Oh, luckily it's 2021, or by the time you guys see this, will be 2022. But these women earned this. They did things that the men wouldn't want to do. They dared to fly. I did cover another much smaller children's book about a Chinese pilot who was part of this. She was one of the last to die, and how her family fought, both for her and then her brother, who actually died overseas, to be buried in a white cemetery. So this is a fantastic book. Great to read. Again, it's Fly Girls by P. O'Connell Pearson. Fantastic book to read to your children. Great history book. It reads really, really well. It flows very well. So that is it for this review. If you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe. I do a lot of books like this. I do smaller children's books. I do fiction. I do nonfiction. I do various different films, both some nostalgic, some recent. I don't go to the theaters. I have a small child, but I cover a bunch of stuff. So be sure to check out my channel, and please ignore that cat. Thank you.